Now, Stan and I grew up in the same village. In fact, it was Capernaum. We have been next door neighbors for a long, long time. I mean, we've been buddies. We're about the same age. We grew up together. We played together. We worked together. We traveled together to Jerusalem. We were friends. Unfortunately, something happened, and Stan and I got really mad at each other. And we got into a really, really serious quarrel. And in this part of the world, a serious quarrel can even be a deadly thing. Either way, it's vicious and it's loud, and we're really mad at each other, but we also know that it ought not to be this way. We've been friends all our lives. Stan, oh man. And of course, in our modern world, I'd humble myself and I'd come over to Stan and I'd say, well, Stan, I'm sorry. We'd just shake on it. And we shake on it, you know, and there's a good way of reconciling while I check his left hand to make sure there isn't a knife to stab me in the back, because this is sort of sentimental and it may make things all right, but I still harbor a lot of hatred or maybe resentment in my heart towards him. It doesn't really work. Now, in the days of Jesus, and in this part of the world, especially even among the Arabs nowadays, today, it's been around for thousands of years. If Stan and I wanted to reconcile, there was only one way to do it. I would approach him and I would say, Stan, would you break bread with me? And if Stan was agreeable to that, he would say yes. I would take the bread, and then, let me ask you a question. Okay, now I know some of you know the answer to this because you've seen this before, some of you, but you've never seen it in this context before, which makes it really neat. Okay, in my hand, everybody look. How many pieces of bread do you see in my hands? Very good. So I pray and I break the bread. Now, how many pieces of bread do you see in my hands? One. You say, oh man, Jay, there's something wrong with your brain. No, this is one piece of bread. It's one piece of bread because it's just broken in two parts. You say that's a technicality. No, it's really not, and you can all relate to this. Let's say that you have a prized vase. You get it down out of your cabinet and you set it on your kitchen counter, and while you're going about trying to set up your house for whatever special occasion it is, you brush past the vase, you knock it down on the floor, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. How many vases are on the floor? One. You see the principle? It's one piece of bread, it's merely in two parts. Now here's what happens, and this is the thinking of these very, very simple people who were not stupid, they just had a different way of thinking. And I want you to start thinking like this. I want to reconcile with Stan, I break the bread, and I hand Stan one half of the one piece of bread. Now what happens is, you don't really have to do this, but Stan would eat this bread, and it would go into his body, and like any food, it becomes part of him. I eat the other half of the same piece of bread. It goes into my body, and like any food, it becomes part of me. The same piece of food that went into his body that became part of him went into my body and became part of me, and vice versa. What does that make us? One is an abstraction. It makes us brothers. It makes us kin. We are now not just symbolically related to each other, but as with the bread, we are now physically related to each other. And that means that we are reconciled. That kinship makes us one. And whatever the quarrel is, even though we remember it, because you can't forget it, only God can forget sins. We can't forget them. But to the shame of either of us, neither of us ever bring it up again. The quarrel is gone, it is dead forever. That's the deal. Now, kings ended wars this way, by breaking bread with each other along with their nobles. They would end wars like that. It was rare, but it did happen. On Jesus' resurrection day, he appeared to his disciples in that room where the disciples were all holed up. Judas was dead, Thomas wasn't there. We don't know if anybody else was missing, but it appears that most of them were all locked in a little room in Jerusalem, and they were terrified. It doesn't sound like your usual Easter pageant, doesn't it? The disciples being really scared and locked in a room that night. But you know, only one of them had seen Jesus, and that was Peter. And we don't even know what happened with that. The only reason we know that is because Paul mentioned it over in 1 Corinthians 15, right at the beginning, and that's it. But Peter was not a happy man at that point. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't be happy for a very long time. Several weeks. But here's what happened. Jesus appears in that locked room. Why are they locked in the room? Because a rumor was being circulated by the Sanhedrin and by the Roman guards who were there when Jesus rose from the dead to say that the disciples came and stole the body. You got to remember, who rolled the stone away? An angel. Who are they saying rolled the stone away? The disciples. When you roll that stone away, you did something else. You broke Roman seals. And if you break a Roman seal, you're the next one on the cross. That's it. So they know that this word is getting around, it's not true, but they're terrified. Jesus materializes in his resurrection body right in their midst, and he says to them, Shalom Alechem, peace be unto you. And they were terrified. And the next thing that Jesus says is, have you got any food? And he ate with them. A week later, they're still in the same room. Thomas is now present. Jesus materializes in that locked room. They're really scared. I mean, the fear is not going to go away for a while until they realize the Romans really aren't looking for them. And Jesus appears in the room. It's him. And he says, Shalom Alechem, peace be unto you. And then he says, have you got anything to eat? And they gave him food, and he ate with them. Now understand this. Everyone in that room, of the night Jesus was betrayed, deserted him to the last man. You say, not John. John did too. He also ran. He screwed up enough courage to follow him at a distance, but he never really got that close. Peter too. But they all deserted him. That is a shameful, shameful act. What did Jesus do with those deserters? He ate with them. He ate with them. Some doubted. Well, Thomas doubted. No, wait a second. The Bible tells us in two different places, some doubted. So Thomas was the one who kind of put his foot in his mouth, but there were others that doubted him. Doubt's a big deal. What did Jesus do with those doubters? He ate with them. And one of them denied him 3 times, even to Jesus' face one of those times, much to his shame. And he was bitter about it. And he was despondent. And following the Lord's instructions and the angel's instructions on that day, finally the disciples packed up out of that room, left Jerusalem, and came here. Where here? Here. Not there, not down there. Here. Somewhere right in this area. Right here. This is Capernaum. This is where they were. This is where the job was. This is where they were from. Jesus said, I'm going on ahead of you. I'll meet you there. When they showed up, he was nowhere to be found. And Peter had had enough. The Peter, who lived over here somewhere, worshipped in that synagogue, is where Jesus taught, and lived in this area, had his fishing boat fleet somewhere right in these waters, on these breakwaters right here. Peter's boats, here. Not somewhere else, not in the story. This is the story. This is it. And he'd had enough. Now I want you to picture this. You don't have to keep your eyes on me, but look at the rocks, look at the water. And Peter says, and it would be in the evening there, he said, guys, I'm going fishing. Now that doesn't mean, look, I'm really stressed out, and I'm going to go down to the lake and drown a few worms. You know how therapeutic that is, and I'll be better in the morning, and then we'll get back on track, right? No, when he says I'm going fishing, all he's saying is this, 2 words, I quit. I'm through with all of this. I'm through being a disciple. I'm through with this whole thing. Jesus isn't even here. Now, he's speaking very deeply emotionally. These people are very, very passionate, emotional people. And he's just despondent, discouraged with all the words you could attach to it because he denied Jesus to his face. Now Jesus isn't even here. I'm going back to my old job. And anybody who wants to come with me can come with me. And right here somewhere on the shore, Peter's boat with his fleet. Remember, he's what we would call middle class. And he's got people that take care of his fishing fleet, family members. He goes over to his old boat. 6 of the disciples, including John, get in that boat with him, and they put out right here. Somewhere in this stretch of water, right here, they go about 100 yards offshore. They don't go out into the middle of the lake. There are no fish out there. That's what made the first miraculous catch of fish in Luke chapter 5, so miraculous. Because he says, put out into deep water and throw out your nets. Peter would say, he didn't say this, but he tried to convince the Lord, no, there's no fish out there. It's like, look, you're the preacher, you preach, I'm the fisherman, I'll fish, but there's not going to be any fish out there. And when he throws his nets out into deep water, he brings in this giant catch of fish. That happened way back. Now it's different. Now Peter's out on the lake, and he goes out there at dusk with the guys in the boat with him, and he casts his nets out all night long with the guys. Now here's the problem. There are lots of boats out there. Don't think they're the only one. I mean, there's fleets of boats out there because this is where the fish are. There are hot springs off the shore here. Fish love all the little bacteria and little tiny, algae and that sort of stuff that the hot springs bring up. So this is an extremely important fishing area, and Peter's boat appears to be the only one that's not catching anything. And in the morning, as the sun begins to come up over the Golan Heights right over here, that Peter is stripped to the waist, which simply means he's down to his loincloth. What's the coldest part of the day? When the sun is starting to come up. It's the coldest part of the day. Peter's down to his loincloth. What does that tell you? He was working hard all night long, and they didn't even get so much as a guppy. But there's a man. They didn't recognize him, standing on the shore. What shore? This shore. Right here. This shore. Not some other shore. This shore. They don't recognize him. They're 100 yards out. The man shouts as if he wants some fish. He wants to buy something. Caught anything? You see Peter go, no. And then finally he says, throw your nets out the right side of the boat. Well, John, maybe he knows something we don't know. And they throw their nets out the right side of the boat, right out here. And they start to bring the nets back in. And it's the single greatest catch of fish these professional fishermen have ever netted. When they did the final count, somewhere on this shore here, when they just laid them all out, they counted, not including the bottom feeders and fish that were small they had to throw back, non-kosher fish, they had 153 large fish that they had, and they were amazed. Well, they throw that net out, they're trying to bring it in, John is trying to get it, more guys come alongside, this is incredible, look at all the fish, and suddenly John figures it out. And he looks at the man who's here, and he's out there, he looks at Peter, and he looks at the fish, and he goes, Peter, this reminds me of Luke chapter 5. Peter, that's the Lord. And he points to the man standing on this shore. And Peter knows it. And he wraps his robe around him and he jumps into the water. I would have done that backwards, but that's what he did. And it's quite shallow out there, so he swam and waded the 100 yards to shore. And as he comes out on the shore, there's Jesus, who has moved away from the shore somewhere closer in these areas here. And he's got a little charcoal fire going. And he's making breakfast. Now, I've heard one pastor say, you know how Jesus makes breakfast? Breakfast. Not today. All you need to make one of these is a little charcoal fire, some oil, flour, water, and salt, and a flat rock, or maybe a little, a piece of metal or something like that. Or it could be not even charcoal. It could even be camel dung. That's what they used. And here's Jesus, and he's baking bread. And he's got a stack of these going. Now, he's got some fish there. We don't know where he got the fish. Fish, I don't know. But he's got the fish, and Peter, right down here somewhere, maybe even right there, who knows, he sits down by the fire next to Jesus and says nothing. Peter's the one who denied him. He still hasn't gotten over this. He's just heartsick and broken and shamed because of it. But then the guys do something that I consider funny. You don't have to laugh at it, but they slide the boat up onto the shore, still dragging the net behind them. They never got it in the boat. Too many fish. And they drag the net over here somewhere, and they spread it all out, and they start sorting through the fish. And then Jesus speaks to Peter, and he says, Peter, bring some of that fish back. And he comes back with the guys. Interesting. And they sit down with Jesus around a little charcoal fire, somewhere right around here, maybe over there, maybe over here, but right in this area. And there Jesus took the bread, and he broke it, and they ate bread and fish together. This is towards the end of Jesus' 40 days in his resurrection body here on this earth before he ascended into heaven, and it's getting right towards the conclusion of that time. These guys who had deserted him, what did he do with those deserters? He ate with them. Who had doubted him, he ate with them. And the one who had denied him 3 times, even to his face, and he ate with him too. And on that day, they never left him again. To their dying days, and only one of them, it appears, survived to old age without martyrdom. They never left him again. Jesus reconciles people to himself. He's already done it. But we forget that sometimes we think we've done things so wrong that God will never take us back. And maybe you came to Israel going, you can't believe what I did just before I came here, or what my life has been like. And he reconciles sinners. For if when we were God's friends, when we were God's buddies, when we were God's obedient children, no, for if when we were God's enemies, Paul said, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more? Having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? What life is that? Something that Jesus told us there in that synagogue. One day in that synagogue, you can find it in John 6, he said, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, but they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. And the bread that I shall give, my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world, I'm the bread of life. I want you to see something. Some of you have seen this before, but go with it. I want you to pretend that my hand is the hand of God the Father in heaven. God the Father in heaven takes Jesus, that miraculous manna that if you eat this bread, you don't just live and die after several generations, you live forever. You take him. And he takes Jesus, the bread of life, the bread from heaven, the miraculous manna, as it were, and he hands him down to sinful man. And he says, will you take my son? Will you take this bread? Will you take him into yourself? And if you do, you and I will be reconciled. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he broke it. And he said, this bread means my body, which is for you. Never forget what you see here tonight. This makes memories. And God the Father hands Jesus, the broken bread of life, down to sinful man. And he says, will you take my son? Will you take him into yourself? If you do, we'll be reconciled. We'll be kin. We'll be one. I will be your father and you will be my child. And the quarrel that I have against you, for your sin against me, I will personally forget for all eternity. Amen. That's why this spot is so important. Jesus did that at the Last Supper, but it culminates right here. And you can read all about it in John chapter 21, and you should. This is your homework for tonight, because you're looking at what it looked like in Jesus' day. You're looking at the place where that actually happened. But the best part is, Jesus is the broken bread, and that means all of us who were his enemies and estranged from him, even as believers who have messed things up, he still is the broken bread who reconciles us back to himself and to each other. Because if you're all eating in communion, you're eating the same piece of bread, your quarrels die right there, even if you remember them. Isn't that amazing? Thank you, Lord Jesus, for this place, for all you've done. Oh, Lord Jesus, to help us see, hear where it happened. Oh, Lord, thank you for grace to bring us here, to drive these things deep into our hearts, that we might not only live by them and practice them, but show others every day, every week, every month, every year, how it works, how it is to love one another. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. God bless you guys.
Hey guys, Mark.